It was just another ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a quiet neighborhood near Alexandria, Virginia. The kind of place where lawns are neatly trimmed, mailboxes match the house colors, and kids usually ride bikes or walk home from school without a second thought. But for one teenager, this day was about to take a sharp turn, through no fault of his own. He was 17, tall for his age, with a calm way about him that made teachers call him mature beyond his years. He'd just wrapped up his robotics club meeting at school, where he'd spent the last 2 hours fine-tuning a small drone for an upcoming science fair. His backpack was heavy, not with trouble but with textbooks, a laptop, and the half-assembled drone carefully wrapped in foam. He wore a gray hoodie not to hide, but because the spring air still carried a bite in the shade. His headphones played a low beat, nothing loud, just enough to keep his mind focused as he walked the familiar 3-block route home. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every dog that barked behind white picket fences, even the old oak tree that dropped acorns right near the corner of Maple and 5th. This was his neighborhood. He'd lived here since he was 6. His mom worked long hours, but she always made sure he had everything he needed: books, encouragement, and clear rules about respect, safety, and staying aware of how the world sometimes sees young black boys, even when they're just walking home with a science project in their bag. As he turned onto Maple Street, he didn't notice the woman watching him from her front porch. She was in her early 40s, sipping tea, scrolling through her phone. When she saw him, hoodie, backpack, hands in pockets, something inside her tightened. She didn't know him, had never seen him before, even though he'd passed her house dozens of times. But in that moment, her mind filled in blanks it shouldn't have. He looked out of place, she'd later say, too tall, too quiet, too something she couldn't name, but that made her uneasy. She told herself she was just being cautious, that it was better to be safe than sorry. Without thinking twice, or maybe because she didn't want to think too hard, she picked up her phone and dialed 911. "He's just standing there," she told the dispatcher, voice low but urgent. "Black male, maybe late teens, hoodie, big backpack. He's looking around like he's checking houses. I don't recognize him. I think he might be casing the neighborhood." The words tumbled out fast, laced with fear that felt real to her, but wasn't based on anything the boy had actually done. He hadn't knocked on doors, hadn't peered into windows, hadn't even slowed his pace. He was just walking, eyes on the ground, lost in thought about whether his drone's rotor needed a lighter material. But once that call went through, the wheels started turning. Within minutes, a patrol car rolled quietly onto the street. The officer stepped out, mid-30s, clean uniform, name tag gleaming in the afternoon sun. He approached the teen with a practiced calm, but his hand hovered near his belt just in case. "Hey, can I see some ID?" he asked. The teen stopped, pulled out one earbud, and blinked in surprise. Sure," he said, voice steady but cautious. He knew this drill. His parents had drilled it into him since middle school. Stay polite, keep your hands visible, don't make sudden moves. He handed over his school ID. "I live right down the street," he added, nodding toward his house. "Just coming back from robotics club." The officer glanced at the ID, then at the bulky backpack. "What's in there?" "My project," the teen said, unzipping it slowly, carefully. "It's a drone. For science fair." But the officer didn't relax. He asked more questions: where exactly he lived, who his parents were, why he was wearing a hoodie on a spring day. Each question felt heavier than the last. Neighbors started peeking out from behind curtains. Someone across the street pulled out a phone and started recording. The teen's heart pounded, but he kept his voice even. He answered every question. He didn't argue. He just wanted to go home, finish his drone, and maybe grab a snack before his mom got back from work. What he didn't know was that his mom wasn't just any working parent. She was someone who carried a badge that commanded respect in rooms most people never entered. Someone who spent her days protecting national security, leading teams of agents, and making tough calls that affected lives far beyond this quiet street. And right now, she was finishing up a high-level briefing downtown when her phone buzzed with a call from her son's school, followed by a missed call from his cell. Her instincts kicked in before she even heard the full story, because she knew better than most how quickly a simple walk home could turn into something dangerous for a young black boy in America. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her keys, told her assistant she was leaving immediately, and headed for the car. Her expression was calm, but her mind was racing. Not with panic, but with a fierce, focused determination. She wouldn't let her son face this alone. As her SUV sped through city streets, the teen stood on the sidewalk surrounded by growing tension, unaware that help was on the way. Help that would not only get him out of this moment, but change how an entire community saw fear, bias, and justice. The sun was still shining. Birds still chirped in the trees. But on that ordinary street, something extraordinary was about to happen. Not with shouting or drama, but with quiet authority, dignity, and a truth that would leave more than one person speechless. She hadn't meant to cause trouble. That's what she kept telling herself as she stood on her porch, phone still warm in her hand. She watched the patrol car pull up, lights off, just a quiet stop on a quiet street. Her chest felt tight, but she told herself she'd done the right thing. Better safe than sorry, she whispered under her breath like it was a shield against doubt. She lived in this neighborhood for over 10 years, raised her kids here, knew most of the families on the block, or at least thought she did. But this teenager? She'd never seen him before. Or maybe she had, but never noticed. Either way, something about him walking down the sidewalk with his hood up and that big backpack just didn't sit right with her. It wasn't that he was doing anything wrong. She'd be the first to admit that, but he just didn't look like he belonged. She told the 911 operator he was loitering, though he'd been walking at a steady pace. She said he was looking around suspiciously, though he'd only glanced at house numbers, trying to remember if he'd passed the blue mailbox yet. In her mind, it all added up to danger. She didn't question why. She just felt it, a flutter in her stomach, a prickle on her neck, and trusted it like it was common sense. Now, watching the officer approach him, she felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief that someone was handling it. Guilt because, well, what if she was wrong? But she pushed that thought away. I'm just looking out for my street, she muttered, crossing her arms like armor. Inside, her house was tidy. Kitchen clean, laundry folded, a half-finished crossword on the coffee table. Normal life. But outside, the scene was shifting. More neighbors were stepping onto their porches now. A few kids on bikes slowed down to watch. Someone across the street held up a phone, not hiding it. The officer had the teen's ID in hand, asking questions that sounded more like accusations. She told herself the police would sort it out. That they'd check his ID, see he lived nearby, and send him on his way. No harm done, but deep down a small voice whispered, what if they don't believe him? She hadn't thought that far ahead. She hadn't imagined the weight of her call, the ripple it would send through someone else's life just because she felt uneasy. She didn't think about how often this happened to kids who looked like him. She didn't consider that suspicious often meant black and in the wrong place, even when the place was their own neighborhood. Back on the sidewalk, the teen stood perfectly still, hands visible, voice calm. He answered every question clearly. He even offered to show the drone inside his bag, carefully pulling out the foam-wrapped pieces to prove it was harmless. But the officer didn't smile, didn't relax, just kept asking, you sure you live here? Which house? Who's your mom? The teen gave the address, repeated it twice, said his mom worked for the government. The officer nodded but didn't seem convinced. Maybe it was the hoodie. Maybe it was the way he held himself. Quiet, serious, not smiling like a good kid should. Or maybe it was just the color of his skin in a neighborhood where most faces looked different. From her porch, she watched it all unfold like a scene from a movie she hadn't meant to start. Her tea had gone cold. She wanted to step forward, say something, maybe even apologize, but pride held her back. What would people think? That she'd overreacted? That she'd called the cops on a kid for no reason? Then down the street, a black SUV turned the corner. Not flashy, not fast, just purposeful. It slowed as it neared the group, and the woman on the porch felt a sudden chill, even in the warm afternoon sun. The driver's door opened. Out stepped a woman in a crisp navy suit, heels clicking softly on the pavement. She moved with a kind of quiet power, shoulders back, eyes sharp, expression unreadable. But the way the officer straightened up the moment he saw her, that told everyone something was different. The teen's face lit up with relief. Mom! The woman didn't rush, didn't yell. She simply walked over, placed a gentle but firm hand on her son's shoulder, and turned to the officer. What's going on here? She asked, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made the air feel heavier. The officer hesitated. Ma'am, we got a call about a suspicious person. I was just verifying. Verifying what? She interrupted, not unkindly, but with a tone that left no room for vagueness. My son was walking home from school. He lives 3 houses down. He's 17. He's holding a science project. What exactly needed verifying? The officer glanced at his radio, then back at her. We just needed to be sure. Sure of what? She pressed. That a black teenager walking in daylight with a backpack is automatically a threat? Is that the standard now? Her words weren't loud, but they cut through the street like a blade. Neighbors stopped whispering. The woman on the porch took a step back, suddenly feeling very small. Then the mother reached into her jacket, not for a weapon, but for a badge. She held it up just long enough for the officer to see. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent in Charge, Washington Field Office. The officer's face went pale. Ma'am, I didn't know. No, she said quietly. You didn't. She turned to her son. Are you okay? He nodded, but his hands were still shaking slightly. She squeezed his shoulder, then looked back at the officer. You detained my child without probable cause, based on a call that described him as suspicious, simply because of how he looked. Do you understand how dangerous that is? The officer swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. Now the woman on the porch couldn't stay hidden anymore. Her heart hammered in her chest. This wasn't just some random mom. This was someone with authority, real authority. Someone who wouldn't let this slide. She walked slowly down her driveway, hands clasped tight, voice trembling as she approached. I'm the one who called, she said, eyes downcast. I didn't mean, I just saw him and got nervous. You thought wrong, the mother said, not unkindly but firmly. Fear isn't an excuse for putting someone else's child at risk. Not in this country. Not on this street. The woman's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I really am. For a long moment no one spoke. The wind rustled the trees. A dog barked in the distance. The tension hung thick in the air, but something had shifted. It wasn't just about a mistaken call anymore. It was about what happens when fear overrides fairness, and what happens when someone with power chooses to respond with truth, not anger. The mother looked at the woman, then at her son, then at the officer. This ends now, she said. But it shouldn't have started at all. And with that, she turned, took her son's arm, and walked him home, past the blue mailbox, past the old oak tree, past the neighbors who now saw them not as strangers but as people who belonged, just like everyone else. The moment the black SUV pulled away from the curb, the street didn't go back to normal. Not really. People lingered on their porches longer than usual. Conversations that had been happening in hushed tones now spilled into full sentences. A few neighbors exchanged glances, some embarrassed, some defensive, others just stunned. The woman who made the call stood frozen near her mailbox, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold something in. She kept replaying the last few minutes in her head. The calm authority in that mother's voice, the way the officer shrank under her gaze, the quiet dignity of the teenager who never raised his voice even when he had every right to. Inside the SUV, it was quiet too, but a different kind of quiet. The kind that comes after a storm, when everyone's still catching their breath. The teenager stared out the window, fingers tapping nervously on his knee. His mom drove with steady hands, eyes on the road, but every now and then she'd glance at him in the rearview mirror. You okay? She finally asked, her voice softer now, just for him. He nodded, but didn't look at her. Yeah, I'm fine, she knew that tone. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. The kind that settles deep when you realize the world sees you differently than you see yourself. He'd done everything right, followed the rules, stayed calm, told the truth, and still he'd been treated like a suspect just for walking home. She pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither moved. Then she turned in her seat. Look at me, he did. His eyes were tired, like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. I'm proud of you, she said. You handled that with more grace than most adults would. He gave a small, sad smile. Does it matter, though? They still stopped me. They still doubted me. She didn't flinch. It matters, because how you respond to injustice shapes who you become, and you chose dignity. That's powerful. Inside the house, the familiar smells of home, coffee, old books, the faint hint of lemon cleaner, usually brought comfort. But today the air felt heavy. He dropped his backpack by the door and walked straight to his room. She let him go. She knew he needed space to process, but she didn't sit down. Not yet. She picked up her phone and called the local police precinct. Not to yell, not to threaten, but to request a formal review of the stop. She asked for the body cam footage. She wanted to know exactly what was said, what was assumed, and whether proper protocol had been followed. She spoke calmly, professionally, but with a steel underneath that left no room for dismissal. Meanwhile, across town, the officer sat in his patrol car, radio silent, staring at his hands. He'd been on the force for 8 years, thought he was fair, thought he treated everyone the same, but now, replaying the encounter in his mind, he saw things he hadn't noticed before. The way he'd tightened his grip on his belt when the teen reached for his ID. The extra questions he wouldn't have asked a white kid with a backpack full of soccer gear. He'd told himself he was just being thorough. But was he? Back in the neighborhood, word spread fast. Someone had posted a short clip online, just 10 seconds of the mother showing her badge, the officer stepping back. It didn't show faces clearly, but the tension was obvious. Comments poured in, some praising her composure, others accusing her of using her position to intimidate, a few even blaming the teen for dressing suspiciously. The woman who made the call saw those comments and felt sick. She hadn't wanted this. She just wanted to feel safe. But now she realized her safety had come at someone else's cost. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, pen in hand, trying to write a note. She'd started and crumpled 3 drafts already. "I'm sorry" felt too small. "I didn't mean to" sounded like an excuse. She wanted to say something real, something that acknowledged the fear she felt but also the harm she caused. Finally she wrote, "I was wrong. I let my fear speak louder than my judgment. I put your son in a situation no child should face just for walking home. I'm working to understand why I reacted the way I did, and I promise to do better." She didn't sign it, just slipped it into an envelope and walked it over to their mailbox after dark, heart pounding like she was doing something illegal. Inside the house, the mother found it the next morning while getting the mail. She read it twice. Then she tucked it into her desk drawer, not to forget it, but to remember that change starts with someone admitting they were wrong. Her son came downstairs, dressed for school. Backpack lighter today, just books, no drone. He looked tired but resolute. "You going back?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "Why should I hide?" "I didn't do anything wrong." She nodded, pride swelling in her chest. "Good, walk tall. And if anyone gives you trouble, I'll call you?" he said with a small grin. She smiled back. "Or better yet, you'll know your worth so clearly you won't need to." But as he walked out the door, she stood at the window watching until he turned the corner. Her job was to protect the country. But her real mission, the one that mattered most, was making sure her child could walk through the world without fear. And that was a fight no badge could fully win. But she'd keep trying for him, for every kid who just wanted to go home in peace. The story didn't stay on that quiet street for long. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Not because anyone shouted it from rooftops, but because someone had filmed part of the encounter. And in today's world, that's all it takes. The video wasn't dramatic. No yelling, no arrests, no flashing lights. Just a calm woman in a suit showing a badge, an officer stepping back, and a teenager standing silently beside her. But the tension in those few seconds spoke volumes. People watched it over and over, trying to read between the lines. At first, it spread through neighborhood group chats and local news tips. Then a regional news station picked it up. "FBI official's son wrongly detained in suburban stop," the headline read. The station didn't show faces clearly, just blurred images and voiceovers, but they included a short statement from the police department. "The incident is under internal review. We take all concerns about bias seriously." That phrase, "take all concerns about bias seriously," sounded official, but to many it felt hollow. Because this wasn't just about one officer or one call. It was about the 1,000 small moments that add up. The extra questions, the lingering stares, the assumption that someone doesn't belong simply because of how they look. And now, because the mother happened to hold a high-ranking position, people were finally paying attention. At school, the teenager kept his head down. He didn't want to be the kid from the video. He just wanted to finish his drone, pass his physics test, and hang out with his friends like any other 17-year-old. But whispers followed him in the halls. Some kids gave him awkward thumbs-ups. Others avoided eye contact, unsure what to say. His robotics teacher pulled him aside gently. If "You ever need to talk? My door's open." He nodded, grateful but exhausted. Meanwhile, his mom faced a different kind of pressure. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Reporters, colleagues, even old friends from the bureau. Some offered support. Others warned her not to make it political. One senior agent even suggested she let it go, don't rock the boat. But she'd spent her career navigating complex situations with integrity. She wasn't about to stay silent now, especially when her own child had been on the receiving end of something she'd seen too many times before. Still, she didn't go on TV, didn't post fiery rants online. Instead, she did something quieter but more powerful. She called the local police chief, not to accuse but to listen. They met in his office 2 days later, just the two of them, no cameras, no notes. She asked honest questions. How are your officers trained to handle calls based on suspicion? Do you review 911 logs for racial bias? What happens when a stop is made without clear cause? The chief, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes and decades on the force, didn't dodge. We're trying, he admitted. But training only goes so far when the calls themselves are biased. Dispatchers get hundreds of suspicious person reports every week. Most are vague, and too many sound like the one about your son. That hit hard, because it wasn't just about the officer on the street. It was about the whole system that let fear become policy. Back in the neighborhood, things were shifting too. The woman who made the call hadn't left her house much since that day. She felt ashamed, yes, but also confused. She'd always thought of herself as fair-minded. She voted for equality. She taught her kids to be kind. So how had she ended up being the one who triggered this whole mess? She started reading. Articles about implicit bias, documentaries about racial profiling, stories from parents who'd feared for their children's safety simply because of their skin color. It wasn't easy. Some of it made her defensive at first, but she kept reading, because she owed it to herself and to that family to understand. One afternoon, she mustered the courage to knock on their door. Not to explain herself again, but to listen. When the mother opened it, there was no anger in her eyes, just quiet caution. "I don't expect you to forgive me," the woman said, voice trembling slightly. "But I want to learn. If you're willing to talk, even just for 5 minutes." The mother studied her for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where the apology note had been read days before. No grand speeches. Just two women, one carrying guilt, the other carrying pain, trying to find common ground. The mother didn't scold. She shared stories about teaching her son to keep his hands visible, about the knot in her stomach every time he left the house, about how exhausting it is to be excellent just to be seen as equal. The woman listened, tears welling up, not because she was being attacked, but because she finally understood the weight of what she'd done. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it was a start. Meanwhile, the police department announced a new pilot program. All suspicious person calls would now be reviewed by a supervisor before officers were dispatched, unless there was an immediate threat. They also partnered with a local nonprofit to train 911 operators on recognizing racially coded language, phrases like "doesn't belong here" or "looks out of place" that often mask bias. The teenager heard about the changes during lunch. One of his friends showed him the news article on his phone. For the first time in days, he smiled, a real one. "Maybe something good can come from this," he said. His mom heard it too. And that night over dinner, she looked at him and said, "You didn't just survive that moment. You helped change it." He shrugged, but his eyes shone. "I just walked home." "Exactly," she said. "And that should never be enough to make someone call the cops on you." Outside, the street was quiet again. Kids rode bikes. Birds sang. But something had shifted in the air, not just in policy, but in people. Because sometimes it takes one ordinary walk home, one mistaken call, and one mother's quiet strength to remind a whole community what fairness really looks like. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood slowly settled into a new rhythm. The buzz from the incident had faded from headlines, but it hadn't disappeared from people's minds. It lingered in quiet conversations over backyard fences, in the way some neighbors now waved a little more warmly, and in the extra pause someone might take before dialing 911 just because a stranger looked out of place. For the teenager, life began to feel normal again, but not the same. He still walked home from school, still wore his hoodie when it was chilly, still carried his backpack full of books and dreams, but something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was paying attention, not with fear but with awareness. He noticed how people's eyes moved when he passed. He saw the difference in how store clerks greeted him versus his friends. And instead of shrinking under it, he stood a little taller, spoke a little clearer, as if to say, "I belong here just as much as you do." His mom watched this change with a mix of pride and heartache. She was glad he was finding his voice, but it hurt knowing he had to carry that weight at all. One evening, while they were washing dishes side by side, her drying, him rinsing, he said quietly, "I used to think if I just worked hard enough, people would see me for who I really am." She paused, towel in hand. "And now?" "Now I know it's not that simple," he said. "But maybe I can help make it simpler for someone else." That sentence stayed with her long after the dishes were put away. A few days later, she got a call from the local high school principal. Not about trouble, but about an idea. The school wanted to start a student-led forum on community safety and trust, and they'd heard the teenager had something powerful to say. Would he be willing to speak? Would she support it? She didn't answer right away. She asked her son first. He thought about it for a whole night. Then over breakfast he said, "Yeah, I'll do it. But not just to talk about what happened to me. I want to talk about what could happen if we all tried to understand each other better." So they began preparing, not with scripts, but with honesty. He wrote down his thoughts in a worn notebook. How it felt to be questioned like a criminal for walking home. How his mom's arrival changed everything not because of her badge, but because she refused to let fear win. And how real safety doesn't come from suspicion, it comes from connection. Meanwhile, the woman who made the call had started showing up at community meetings. She didn't speak much at first, just listened. She sat next to parents, teachers, even a few off-duty officers, all trying to figure out how to build trust in a world that often feels divided. One night after a particularly emotional discussion about kids and policing, she raised her hand. "I used to think calling the police was just being responsible," she said, voice soft but clear. "But I've learned that responsibility also means asking why I feel afraid, and whether that fear is fair. I made a mistake, but I don't want it to be the end of my story. I want it to be the beginning of doing better." No one clapped, but several people nodded. That was enough. The day of the school forum arrived. The auditorium wasn't packed, maybe 50 people, but the energy was real. Students, parents, a few local officers in plain clothes, even the police chief sat in the back row. The teenager walked to the mic without notes. Just his truth. "I'm not here to blame anyone," he began. "I'm here because I believe most people don't wake up wanting to hurt others. But sometimes, without even knowing it, we do. Like when we assume someone's dangerous just because they look different. Or when we teach our kids to be careful around certain neighborhoods but never ask why those neighborhoods are labeled that way." He spoke about his drone project, how building something that flies takes patience, balance, and trust in the design. Society's like that too, he said. If one part's broken, like trust between neighbors or between communities and police, the whole thing wobbles. But it can be fixed. We just have to be willing to rebuild it together. After he finished, there was silence. Then slow, steady applause, not loud, but deep. Like people were clapping not just for him, but for the hope he'd just planted. His mom watched from the side, arms crossed, eyes glistening. She didn't cry, she wasn't that kind of person, but her chest felt full in a way it hadn't in years. Later that week, the local paper ran a small feature, Teens' Message on Trust Spark's New School Initiative. It mentioned the upcoming youth police dialogue sessions, where students and officers would meet monthly to talk, not as suspects and enforcers, but as people. The teenager didn't become a celebrity. He didn't want to, but something had changed in how he saw himself and how others saw him. Teachers asked for his opinion on school safety plans. Classmates came to him when they felt misunderstood. Even the school janitor gave him a quiet nod in the hallway, like they shared a secret understanding. At home, things felt lighter too. His mom still worked long hours, but now they made time, real time, to talk. Not just about the world, but about dreams, music, even silly things like what kind of pizza to order on Fridays. The incident hadn't defined them. It had revealed them. And in the neighborhood, small acts of repair continued. The woman who called the police started volunteering with a group that trains 911 dispatchers to spot biased language in emergency calls. She didn't do it for praise. She did it because she finally understood. Safety isn't just about protecting your own space, it's about making sure everyone feels safe in theirs. One evening, as the teenager walked home under a sky streaked with orange and pink, he passed the house where it all began. The porch light was on. The woman was watering her plants. She saw him, froze for a second, then gave a small, hesitant wave. He didn't have to wave back. But he did, not because he'd forgotten, but because he chose to believe people can change. And in that simple gesture, two people acknowledging each other on an ordinary street, an ordinary evening, something quietly extraordinary happened. Not justice exactly, but the beginning of healing. And sometimes that's where real change starts. Summer arrived with long golden afternoons and the hum of cicadas in the trees. For most kids, it meant freedom, late nights, lazy mornings, and the sweet relief of no homework. But for the teenager at the center of everything, this summer felt different. Not heavier exactly, but fuller. Like he was carrying something important, not as a burden, but as a purpose. He'd been accepted into a summer engineering program at a top university, thanks in part to his drone project and the quiet strength he'd shown during that now famous school forum. The scholarship covered everything: tuition, housing, even a small stipend. When the acceptance letter came, he read it 3 times before showing his mom. She didn't cry, but she hugged him longer than usual, and he knew what it meant. This wasn't just about school. It was proof that his future wouldn't be defined by one moment on a sidewalk. Still, he didn't forget that moment. In fact, he carried it with him like a compass. During orientation week, when students introduced themselves, he didn't mention the incident outright. But when someone asked what inspired him to study engineering, he said, "I believe things can be built better. Not just machines, systems, communities, trust. And if you see something broken, you don't just walk away, you try to fix it." A few students nodded. One even came up to him later and said, "My brother went through something similar last year. It's good to hear someone talk about it without anger." That meant more than any award. Back home, his mom had also been busy, but not just with work. She'd been invited to speak at a regional conference on community policing. She almost said no. She wasn't looking for a spotlight. But then she thought about her son's words. Maybe I can help make it simpler for someone else. So she accepted. Her talk wasn't full of jargon or policy charts. It was personal. She spoke about the knot in her stomach every time her child left the house, about the extra rules she'd taught him, not because he was reckless, but because the world sometimes treats black boys like threats before they've even spoken. She talked about the day she arrived on that street and saw her son standing there, calm but shaken, while an officer questioned his right to exist in his own neighborhood. "I wear a badge," she said, standing at the podium in a simple blazer, voice steady. "But that day I wasn't an agent. I was just a mom. And all I wanted was for my child to be seen as human, not as a suspicion." The room was silent when she finished. Then slowly people began to stand, not out of pity but out of recognition. Many were officers themselves, some with kids, some who'd made mistakes, all trying to do better. Afterwards, several approached her, not to defend the system but to ask, what can we do differently? She didn't have all the answers, but she gave them one. Start by listening, especially to the people you're supposed to protect. Meanwhile, the woman who made the 911 call had taken a big step. She'd signed up for a community ambassador program that worked directly with the local 911 center. Once a week, she sat in on training sessions, not as an expert, but as someone who'd learned the hard way. She shared her story with new dispatchers, how fear can sound like caution, how he didn't look like he belonged is often code for bias, and how one call can change a life. At first, she stumbled over her words, felt like a fraud, but the dispatchers listened. Some even thanked her. "We get calls like that all the time," one said. "It helps to hear it from someone who lived it." She also started attending the monthly youth police dialogue sessions at the high school. She didn't speak much, just sat in the back listening as teenagers and officers talked about everything from traffic stops to video games to what respect really means. One evening, the teenager saw her there. He didn't say anything, just gave her a small nod. She nodded back. No words needed. Back at the university program, the teenager was thriving. He spent his days coding flight paths for drones, testing lightweight materials and collaborating with students from all over the country. But in the evenings, he'd often sit on the dorm steps watching the campus come alive with laughter and music and think about home. One night, he called his mom. "You know," he said, "I used to think I had to prove I wasn't a threat. Now I realize I don't have to prove anything. I just have to be me. And if people can't see that, that's their problem, not mine." She smiled into the phone. "You've grown up fast." "Or maybe," he said softly, "I just finally got to breathe." As summer wound down, the neighborhood prepared for a new school year. But things weren't the same as before. The community center launched a Know Your Neighbor night. Potlucks, games, open conversations. The police department started hosting Coffee with Cops events where kids could ask real questions without fear. And the school added a new elective, civic engagement and community trust. The teenager didn't take the class, he was heading off to college soon, but he helped design the first lesson plan. It included role-playing scenarios, discussions on media bias, and even a guest talk from his mom via video call. On his last night at home before moving into his dorm, he and his mom sat on the porch, just like they had when he was little. Fireflies blinked in the yard. The air smelled like cut grass and distant rain. "You proud of me?" he asked, half joking. She looked at him, really looked, and said, "Every single day." He grinned. "Even when I leave my socks on the floor?" "Especially then," she said, laughing. But beneath the laughter was something deeper. Peace. Not because the world was perfect, but because they'd faced something hard and come out of it not broken but bonded. Not bitter but better. And as the stars came out one by one, lighting up the same sky that watched over that fateful walk home months ago, they both knew. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The first day of college felt like stepping into a whole new world. Not just because of the towering brick buildings, the sea of unfamiliar faces, or the weight of a brand new backpack, but because, for the first time, no one knew his story. No one looked at him and thought, "Oh, that's the kid from the video." Here, he was just another student, wide-eyed and ready to learn. And that felt like freedom. He'd chosen a school known for its engineering program, but also for its strong focus on ethics and social responsibility. During orientation, he sat in a lecture hall listening to a professor talk about technology not just as tools, but as reflections of the values of those who build them. "A drone can spy, or it can deliver medicine to a remote village," the professor said. "The difference isn't in the machine. It's in the mind behind it." Those words stuck with him, because he'd already lived that truth. His drone, once just a science project, had become a symbol of something bigger. The idea that what you create and how you move through the world matters. Back home, his mom watched the campus welcome video the school posted online. She didn't see him in the crowd, but she smiled anyway. She knew he was there, standing tall, hoodie or not, finally just being a kid with dreams, not a headline. But she hadn't stepped back from the work they'd started together. If anything, she'd leaned in harder. The local police department had asked her to help design a new training module for officers, one that didn't just check boxes, but actually changed how they saw people. She worked with psychologists, community leaders, and even a few former students from the Youth Dialogue program. The result wasn't a lecture. It was a series of real-life scenarios. What do you do when a caller says a teen looks suspicious but can't say why? How do you respond when your gut says one thing, but the facts say another? The training rolled out quietly without fanfare. But within months, dispatch logs showed a 30% drop in vague, suspicious person calls in their district. Not because people stopped feeling uneasy, but because they were learning to question that unease before turning it into action. Meanwhile, the woman who'd made that original call had become something unexpected. A bridge. She still lived on the same street, still watered her plants every evening. But now she also co-led a monthly workshop called Bias and Belonging. It wasn't flashy. Just a small room at the community center, folding chairs, coffee, and styrofoam cups. But people came. Parents, teachers, even a few retired officers. They talked about fear, assumptions, and the quiet courage it takes to say, "I was wrong." One evening, a young mother raised her hand. "I caught myself last week," she said, voice trembling. "My daughter pointed to a black man walking his dog and said, 'Mom, is he nice?' And I realized I'd never taught her to ask that about white people. I just assumed they were safe, but him? I hesitated. The room fell silent. Then the woman who'd once called 911 said gently, "That's the moment change begins. Not when you're perfect, but when you notice." Back on campus, the teenager was making his own kind of impact. He joined a student group focused on equity and STEM. They hosted panels, mentored high schoolers, and even built a simple app that helped students report biased incidents anonymously, so patterns could be seen, not ignored. He didn't do it for credit. He did it because he remembered how alone he'd felt that day on the sidewalk. No one should have to carry that silence. One afternoon, he got an email from his old high school. The principal wanted to invite him back for graduation, not as a speaker, but as an example. "You showed our students that your story doesn't end with what happens to you," the email read. "It begins with what you choose to do next." He said yes. The night before he was set to return home, he called his mom. "I keep thinking," he said, "what if that day had gone differently? What if you hadn't shown up? What if I'd lost my temper? What if no one believed me?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Then we'd be living a different story. But we're not. We're living this one, the one where truth met courage and something good grew from it." On graduation day, the sun shone bright. Families filled the bleachers, balloons bobbed in the breeze, and proud students tossed their caps into the air. He sat in the front row, not in a cap and gown, but in a simple button-down shirt, watching the faces of kids he'd once walked the halls with. Some had faced their own battles, some with bias, some with poverty, some with just trying to be seen. After the ceremony, a group of younger students approached him. "We saw your talk last year," one said. "It made me want to speak up when I see something unfair." He smiled. "Then I did my job." Later, as he walked back through the neighborhood one last time before heading back to college, he passed the porch where it all began. The woman was there pruning her roses. She looked up surprised, then gave a small wave. He stopped. "Your workshops," he said. "Do they help?" She wiped her hands on her apron. "Some days, yes. Some days I still mess up. But I keep showing up. That's all anyone can ask," he said. They stood there for a moment, not as accuser and accused, not as victim and bystander, but as two people trying to do better in a world that's never simple. That night, over a late dinner, his mom asked, "What's next for you?" He thought about it. "I don't know yet. Maybe build drones that help in disasters. Maybe teach. Maybe just keep showing up like she's doing." She nodded. That's enough. Because in the end, it wasn't about grand gestures or viral moments. It was about ordinary people choosing, again and again, to see each other clearly, to replace fear with curiosity, suspicion with respect, silence with conversation. And in that choice, day after day, street after street, something real began to grow. Not just safety, but belonging. Not just justice, but humanity. And that was a story worth continuing. 4 years later, the neighborhood looked much the same. Same tree-lined streets, same porch swings, same quiet hum of everyday life. But if you looked closer, you'd see the changes. The community center now had a bright mural on its side, hands of all shades reaching toward each other with the words, "See me, hear me, know me," painted in bold letters. The local police station kept a small display in its lobby, not of awards, but of photos from youth dialogues, coffee mornings, and student-led safety projects. And every spring, the high school held a belonging week, where students shared stories, not just about who they were, but about who they hoped their community could become. On this particular afternoon, a young man walked down Maple Street, taller now, shoulders broader but still with that same calm step. He wore a light jacket instead of a hoodie, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He'd just landed at the airport after a long flight, coming home for the first time not as a student on break, but as a graduate, degree in hand, future wide open. He paused near the old oak tree, the one that used to drop acorns right at the corner. He smiled. So much had happened under its branches. Fear, doubt, courage, change. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, sleek drone, his final college project. It wasn't for spying or surveillance. It was designed to map green spaces in underserved neighborhoods, helping cities plant more trees where shade was scarce. He powered it on, watched it hover silently for a moment, then gently guided it back into its case. His mom was waiting on their porch, not in a suit this time, but in jeans and a soft sweater. She didn't say much when he hugged her, just held on a second longer than usual. Inside, the house smelled like it always had. Coffee, old books, home. But now there was a new photo on the wall. Him in cap and gown standing beside her, both of them smiling like they'd crossed a finish line together. Later that evening, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. Fireflies blinked in the yard. A neighbor walked by with her dog and waved.
"Welcome back,"
She called. He waved back. No hesitation, no second guessing. You ever think about how different things could have been? He asked quietly. His mom sipped her tea. Every parent does. But I don't dwell on it, because look where we are. And where they were was this, a community that had stumbled, faced its flaws, and chosen to grow. The woman who made that 911 call now ran a nonprofit that trained emergency call centers across 3 states. She'd even testified before a state committee about updating 911 protocols to reduce bias-driven dispatches. She wasn't famous, but she was effective, and she did it all without ever mentioning that one day on Maple Street. She let her work speak for itself. The police officer who'd stopped him, he'd stayed on the force but changed his approach. He became one of the lead trainers for the new community engagement program. At a recent session, a young recruit asked him, "How do you know when a call is really about safety and not just fear?" He thought for a moment, then said, "You ask yourself, would I treat my own kid this way if someone called about them? If the answer's no, dig deeper." Back at the house, the graduate scrolled through his phone. A message popped up from a high school student in another state. "Your TEDx talk helped me start a bias awareness club at my school." "Thank you." He showed it to his mom. She just nodded, like she'd expected nothing less. The next morning, he visited his old high school, not as a guest, but as a mentor. He sat with a group of robotics students, not to lecture, but to listen. One shy kid asked, "Did you ever feel like people saw you as a problem instead of a person?" He didn't flinch. "Yeah, more than once. But I learned something. You can't control how people see you at first, but you can keep showing up until they see the truth." Afterward, he walked the halls one last time, past the science lab where he'd built his first drone, past the auditorium where he'd spoken about trust, past the front office where the principal had once called his mom in tears, worried about what the incident would do to him. Now that same principal handed him a certificate, Community Changemaker Award. He didn't frame it. He tucked it into his bag, next to the drone. That evening, the neighborhood held a small gathering at the community center. Not for him, officially, but everyone knew he was the reason they were all there. There was music, grilled food, kids running around. The woman who'd once called 911 stood near the punch bowl, talking with a group of teens about how to recognize bias in everyday language. She saw him and smiled, not with guilt but with quiet respect. He didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. His life was the message. As dusk settled, he walked home alone, just like he had all those years ago. Same street, same sidewalk, but everything felt different. Not because the world had magically fixed itself, but because he'd refused to let one moment define him. And because the people around him had chosen to learn, to listen, to do better. His mom was on the porch again, waiting. "Proud of you," she said simply. He sat beside her. "I'm proud of us." They watched the stars come out one by one. No sirens, no fear, just peace. And in that quiet moment, under a sky that held no judgments, only light, it was clear. The story wasn't about a call, a stop, or even a badge. It was about what happens when ordinary people choose empathy over assumption, courage over comfort, and hope over habit. It was a story still being written in neighborhoods, classrooms, and hearts every single day. And as long as people kept choosing to see each other fully, it would keep growing, not with noise but with grace, not with blame but with belonging. And that was the most real ending of all.